Welcome to our lecture today that I call Fire and Sacrifice. We're going to be looking at the early Vedic religion, the text called the Rig Veda, and the rituals found therein. Now, this is a part of a 3-lecture series in which we'll look at the early Rig Veda rituals, we'll look at fully developed Vedic rituals. These are in the past, then we're going to look at contemporary Vedic rituals. So we're no longer sort of in the part of the course where I'm sort of framing things and trying to define Hinduism. Today, we begin exploring the actual contents of quote unquote Hinduism or Hinduisms, and we'll be looking at this early Vedic civilization and culture. Now, the word Hindu, in fact, isn't used here at all, and it wouldn't have had any meaning to the Vedic people. You don't find the term Hindu in any of the Vedic texts. Now, remember, the term Hindu was derived from the people that lived to the east of the Sindhu River in the west of India. Now, modern Hindus, and quite a few modern Hindus, will claim that early Vedic civilization is essentially Hinduism and is identical with Hinduism in every way. They'll in fact argue that all of the contents of contemporary Hindu culture are found in this Rig Veda. That said, you might struggle as we go through these Rig Vedic rituals and contents to really be able to recognize what you would see in modern Hinduism. Now, when it comes to understanding this historical Vedic civilization, we have no real archaeological data. We do have supposedly perfectly preserved scriptures that were orally transmitted. And it's said that when Max Muller actually edited together and published the Sanskrit texts of the Rig Veda, he took a Brahmin from Chennai in the south, from Calcutta in the northeast, and one from Bombay in the southwest, and he had them all chant, and he looked at his text and went, whoa, they're exactly the same. They have preserved this text perfectly over the years, and we're going to see some of those textual transmission techniques in one of the videos we'll be watching. That said, and I've noticed this, that we do have written Sanskrit texts of these Rig Veda scriptures, and we have them for quite a while. Now, while it's said in various later texts that to write down the Vedas is considered a corruption, clearly people were doing it because we have the manuscripts. And I know that I've been sitting before in a place called the Catalogus Catalogorum, which is a Latin name for like the Grand Catalog, which is a catalog of all the Sanskrit manuscripts throughout India. And you can find it at the University of Madras in Chennai. And in fact, there they were telling me that they had a professor come in who was an expert in Vedas, and he looked through a whole bunch of manuscripts, and he was able to find a specific accent that was different in a couple of the manuscripts than the other, but that would confirm his earlier idea of an accent on a word. So it's close. It's really close to being perfectly preserved, but it's not exactly identical. But for the most part, it is. Okay, so today we're going to look at, and Max Muller did that at the end of the 19th century. That's when the first actual sort of printed Sanskrit edition of these texts came out, specifically of the Rig Veda. Today we will look at the culture of the Rig Veda. Now, the Rig Veda is the earliest of the Vedas. It's the Vedas of hymns or riches. RC is rich or Rick. So it's the Veda of hymns. Now, we can be assured that these hymns were used in a ritual environment, but we don't have ritual texts from the time. We can only sort of infer the exact details of the ritual by looking at the contents of the hymns and, maybe looking at the later texts and trying to read backward. So the rituals that we find in the Vedas, these rituals mostly of fire sacrifices, don't look like what you see in a contemporary Hindu temple. Now, in a contemporary Hindu temple, you have what's called puja, which literally means worship. So you see this guy up on the top who's a Brahmin, and he's doing a puja, worshiping and offering to and images. Well, puja, in fact, the rituals of pujas doesn't really get established until the Tantras, which were in the medieval period. So from 600 to 1300 CE. We're looking at stuff that's 1500 BCE, which I'll talk about in a second. So as I'd said at the top of this, the next 2 lectures are going to be about Vedic rituals performed in the past. But the lecture after that is going to describe contemporary Vedic rituals. Now, these days, only a small minority of Brahmins function as priests and perform rituals in temples, and an even smaller amount of Brahmins maintain traditional Vedic rituals and scriptural study. So this is not to say that the Vedic tradition has died out. In fact, it's still around, but it's very small. when once upon a time it was the prominent ritual culture among Brahmins. So where does this stuff all come from? So to see what happens and understand what's going on in the Rig Veda and in early historical Vedic civilization, we have to go further back to see what came before it. Well, the first major civilization that we find on the Indian subcontinent, and when I say Indian subcontinent, I mean South Asia in general, were a group called the Harapans. And the Harapans were also known as the Indus Valley civilization because they sort of lived in this in the river valley, in the river basin of the Indus River. Now, the Indus River Basin, when the Harapan dynasty, would have been found in what is now the northwest of India and the east of Pakistan. This is actually in an area that we call the Panjab, which means Panjab, the land of the 5 waters, sometimes the 5 rivers. So the Harapans thrived between 2600 and 1900 BCE, that's before the Common Era, though they persisted until 1300 BCE. So they were around, and there was a little bit of like lagging overlap with the Brahmins that were doing the Rig Veda. We'll see that in just a second. But what do we know about these people? Well, we call their era, and we call this time period where they thrived, the first urbanization, because it was the first sort of setup of Indian city-states. What evidence do we have for this culture? Well, we have cities and ruins. We also have quite a bit of metal jewelry and some metal weapons. Also, we have these things called seals. So these were images that were used to likely display ownership or show kingliness. So we have these sort of metal seals, and you can see one on the right, and they often depict people and animals together. The contents of them are very difficult to understand. We think there are symbols on some of these seals that look like writing, but no one has ever been able to decipher this sort of the Indus Valley seals or the Harapan language. So there have been a lot of guesses. I haven't found any of them convincing. I definitely can't figure out what they are. They're scrawls to me that we can't figure out. So they don't have a language that's preserved. Whereas when we come to this next culture, we'll see they have quite the language in the Rig Veda. All right, so among these seals, we have one very, very famous seal, and it's the so-called Pashupati Mahadeva seal. Now, folks look at this seal, and I'll get back to that name in a second. They look at this seal, and you can see it here. It's a guy with a throne or some horns. He may have multiple heads, or that might be a headdress. He has animals around him. He's sitting somewhat cross-legged or something. He appears to have a robe around himself. Folks have said that this must be a yogi. This must be somebody doing yoga, but nothing like yoga as we know it in any era would have been going on at that time. Some people say that it is in fact Shiva. And in fact, you see this name Pashupati, and it means the Lord of the beasts. Look at all the beasts around him, which is a name for Shiva. And in fact, the full name for this seal, if you were to say, look it up on the internet or in a book, would be the Pashupati Mahadeva seal. So Mahadeva means great Lord and is a name for Shiva. So lots of folks have decided that this is Shiva. Now, you look at his body position and you look at Shiva and you say, okay, they're both cross-legged, but what's really going on in this seal? I mean, I think what's going on is this is a king, and that this body position he is in is not a religious position, but it's a position that confers sort of sovereignty. You'll see different positions in India as time passes, where kings are usually depicted with one leg up and one leg down to show that they are powerful or that they are kingly. So I think this is a royal position. I think this is a king, and this is an image that a king used to show dominance over something. Some people have even looked at the horns on his head and thought that there's some sort of Indo-European sort of mountain god here that stretches back to our earliest, versions of deities in the West. I don't think we're ever going to figure out what this guy is, but I'm pretty sure he's just a king in a sovereign position. Other people have said that he's epiphalic, that he has an erection, as a lot of early depictions of Shiva has, but I really think that's just a knot on his robe. So you can speculate yourself all day long, but I'm convinced that this is a king and not a Shiva in any way. What we do know about them is that they were an autochthonous community. That's a great word. I'll say that again. That means self-arisen. So these were Indians, you know, these are Indians. This wasn't a culture that came from anywhere else that we can figure out. So this was early India. And this culture collapsed right before the Brahmins started to arrive. So at a certain point, right around 1500 BCE, we see a new religion and a new culture arise in this area of the Panjab. Who are these people? Well, this is the early Vedic, or even you could say Indo-European culture. Now, this is a little bit controversial, but I'll give you my arguments on this. At some point around 1500 BCE, before the Common Era, speakers of what we call Old Indo-Iranian language entered India. And specifically, they entered to North India, now the Punjab, the land of the five waters, the five rivers. And they settled down and they composed what we now have as the Rig Veda. Now, this idea is called the Aryan migration theory. For a second, let's look at this word Aryan. Aryan means pure or holy. It might even go back to a cognate that means like killer or warrior. You heard in the 20th century, you had a group called the Nazis who believed in Germany that they were the true Aryans. And they did believe that the true pure culture was an Indo-European one that included Indians. But this is not what we're talking about here. Aryan is a very old word that's found in the earliest of our Sanskrit sources, and it just means the pure ones, the Brahmins, the Sanskrit speakers. So when we talk about the Aryan migration theory, this is that those speakers of early Sanskrit, that we can also call Old Indo-Iranian, traveled from somewhere north and likely west, somewhere probably in Persia, and that they settled down, and by sort of intermarrying and settling down with the folks of India at the time, their language coalesced to become Sanskrit. So what is Sanskrit? But it's that early Indo-Iranian or early Iranian that intermingles with the languages there, and then we get what we now know as Sanskrit, specifically Vedic Sanskrit, the oldest form of Sanskrit. Now, linguistically, this is clear. I mean, this is not hard to establish linguistically and scientifically. In fact, we see that Sanskrit amongst the Indo-European language families, and I'll talk about that in just a second, is one of the earliest. And in fact, if I go and I look at Old Iranian and a language called Avestan, it has so many cognate words with Sanskrit that I can actually read it all right, which is kind of wild. So there's definitely a linguistic connection. There's an argument as to whether the original Sanskrit culture is completely Indian with no influence, which I don't buy. But I would say that the Rig Veda, the scriptures of the Vedas, are essentially Indian in any way. It's not like they were written in Persia and then they came to India. They are essentially Indian. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Okay, so what do I mean by Indo-European linguistics? Well, in fact, we see that languages such as Sanskrit, Persian, Greek, Latin, German, and English, so English and Sanskrit, are all part of the same language family. We see certain common words like hasta for hand, matri for mother, sveda for sweat. If you look at this wonderful picture that I quite love, you see that you have this early Indo-European, or even a language that you can see before it that we don't have preserved, but we can kind of reverse engineer it, called Proto-Indo-European. From Proto-Indo-European, you come out of that and you see the European languages and you see the Indo-Iranian languages. And if you kind of trace through those trees, you can see where everything kind of comes from. It's sort of exciting, I think, at least. Okay, so all of these languages develop from one another and from a common language that I said that has not survived, but you can find it under all the languages. You sort of reverse engineer it. This is called Proto-Indo-European. My guess is that Proto-Indo-European was spoken somewhere around contemporary Persia, and that it spread outward in all directions. When it came to India, it absorbed a wide range of linguistics and cultural contexts and became what we call Vedic Sanskrit, and the culture becomes early Vedic, historical Vedic culture. Now remember, while the historical details of how this might happen continue to be debated, the linguistics cannot be disputed. It's well-founded scientifically that these languages are connected. All right, so what is the early Vedic religion and what are some of the sources for this? Well, one of our main source is scripture, and our early scripture is the Rig Veda. So this main scripture from this area that we think was originally composed around 1500 BCE is called the Rig Veda. Now, Rig, which comes from rich, means a hymn. So the Rig Veda is a collection, Rig Veda Samhita. Samhita means book or collection. So the Rig Veda Samhita, the name of the text, is the collection of lore or collection of truths about hymns. Now, the Rig Veda contains 1,028 hymns organized into 10 chapters called mandalas. The chapters are called mandalas. Mandala means circle. We'll talk more about them, of course. These hymns would be used in rituals, but we don't really have ritual records or ritual texts from this time. So we have to kind of reverse engineer the rituals based on in-text context and carefully hypothesizing based on later ritual texts. Roughly 1,000 years after the Rig Veda, in like the year 500, there had developed a wide range of ritual sources to explain the rituals that these hymns would be used in. So let's go over the 4 Vedas very quickly. We're really only going to talk about the Rig Veda at this time because we're looking at the early Vedic situation. We'll talk about the other Vedas in a subsequent lecture. So the Rig Veda is made up of hymns, and it's, to no surprise, it's written in verse. The Sama Veda is the Veda of the melodies. It describes how you chant the hymns and rituals. So it gives you all of sort of the melodies and the cadences and the style of the singing. The Rg Veda Samhita is a text that describes all the ritual procedures and lores. It also explains, it's like, well, if you don't have this plant, use this plant. If you don't have a black spotted goat, you can use a white spotted cow. So it'll have substitutions if you have ritual problems. Finally, you have the Atharva Veda Samhita. Now that's the last, sort of the latest of the Vedas, and it contains a lot of pragmatic lore, sort of like magic, healing rituals, rituals to ward off evil spirits, rituals to support kings. Now, another thing I wanted to make a point of is that these different Vedas were known by 4 different priests. The Rig Veda was that all the chanting was done by the guy that knew it would be the guy that sort of spoke the lore, would speak the hymns. Then the Sama Veda priest would sing the hymn atop that. The Rg Veda priest would do all the rituals, and then the Atharva Veda priest would be silent, looking for errors that anybody else would make, and then doing rituals to fix those errors. This leads us to the realization that that 4th priest and that 4th Veda was clearly the last one. It was the 3 Vedas, and then they added one on top. So that's that. So where do the Vedas come from? What are the Vedas? So the Vedas are thought to be what's called Shruti as opposed to Smriti. Now, what does that term mean? Now, Shruti means something that is heard. It is a ritual, or it is something that might be chanted. A Smriti means something that is remembered and written down. So one way to think of it is Shruti are like the mantras and the essentially holy revealed sort of songs that are used in ritual spaces and are used as mantras. Smriti is something that's been written down. It's philosophy. It's it's narrative. It's ritual sources. One good way to remember it is Shruti is chanted, Smriti is not. Now, all of these Vedas are said to be aparushaya, which means personless or authorless. In this sense, there were these characters named rishis. Now, rishi means seers. The rishis were the ones who saw the Vedas in the universe and then sang them out and composed them. So, Shruti and Smriti, so that which is heard and that which is remembered. Aparushaya, it's authorless. The Vedas weren't written by God. They weren't written by man. They're thought to just exist in the universe. Now, my first teacher would always give this great example on the Vedas. He said they are self-existing everywhere, which means the rishis were just the guys who could like tune in, like you're turning into a radio signal. The radio signal is always out there, but the rishis were able to tune the dial to the point that they could see or hear, they could hear these Vedas. This always led me to ask, like, well, if they're the eternal sound of the universe, then would they be exactly the same on another planet? Now, if you really read these, you can see how someone composed them. And in fact, every one of the hymns will tell you which seer heard, saw, and spoke the various hymns. Now, one other thing I want you to think about is that this was a religion that was on the move. We read a lot about horses and cattle grazing, but we also read about a lot of cattle rustling, people stealing other people's cows and wandering off with them. Wealth was measured in cows and in women. We also see quite a lot written about chariot races and battles. So these characters were pastoralists on the move, grazing their cattle. And we see them settle a little bit, but for the most part, this was a kind of a warlike group who did their rituals and tried to get as much land as they could. In Doniger, she says that they wanted to be expansive, wide across the earth, to own wide amount of land. And they really did not like the notion of being settled or fenced in any way, to experience amhas, or the anxiety about being fenced in somewhere. Okay, so who are our people in the Vedas? Well, we have devas, or gods, asuras, who are the anti-gods, and manusha, which are the humans. Manu, man, another connection. Deva, divinity, another Indo-European connection. So I'm going to show some pictures as I go over some of these gods, but remember, there are no images in the Vedas. We have some descriptions of gods, but nobody was making statues of them and nobody was making paintings of them. In this picture here, you have a famous later story about how the asuras on one side and the gods on the other side took the snake Ananta, the world snake, and then they took Mount Meru, the biggest mount in the world, and they turned it upside down, tied the snake around it, and pulled one side of the other in order to churn the oceans, and out of which came all culture and all goodness. Okay, so when you're thinking about the devas and the asuras, you got to realize that they have a long-standing conflict. The devas are inherently good and on the side of humans, and the asuras are sort of like a demonic horde. Now, another word for the devas or gods is sura. So asura means not gods, the anti-gods. The thing is about these characters, they all kind of act the same. The devas and the asuras are nutty because the devas are often really sneaky and cheat the asuras and whatnot. And the asuras are often quite noble. What's going on is a constant battle and it's a constant conflict. And the devas side with humans and the asuras side with the ogres, the rakshasas, and a wide range of demonic groups. Many of the conflicts that you read about involve disrupting rituals and stealing the Soma, the divine drink, or stealing the goods of the ritual, or making sure the ritual just doesn't happen, so that'll screw over the person who's trying to do the ritual. So I like to think of them as a sort of celestial Hatfields and the McCoys. The Hatfields and the McCoys were, I believe in the 19th century, were a feuding group of Kentuckians, I believe. Or were they in West Virginia? I can't remember for sure. But the thing is, they had a feud that lasted years and years, and they would go back and forth, and there were killings and reprisals and whatnot. But they're just all like warring clans. So I like to think of the devas and the asuras as just like warring cousins that just plain didn't get along. All right, so let's look at some of these gods. First, let's look at Brahma. Brahma is considered to be the creator of the universe. Even here in the early phase of the Rig Veda, you see Brahman isn't that big of a deal. He's considered to be the creator god. And his name Brahma means something like from Brah means like swollen, as in filled with goodness or swollen with possibility or the creative principle. When you have the Brahmin priests, they're actually, in Sanskrit, they're not called Brahmins, they're called Brahmanas, which means the people of Brahma, or the people of Brahman. So like I said, his name means swollen. He is a god, but when his name is shortened or lengthened, depending on the way you look at it, it sort of means a creative principle, the root of all beings. When he is depicted, he has 4 heads, and it's often said that he chants the Veda with each of his heads. Now, there's another god who's a little bit more common in many ways, we don't hear about much in the Rig Veda, named Prajapati. And that name means like the progenitor, he who's the lord of all people, or even bearer of all people. So what I want you to remember is Brahma, creator, even though he's not really all that important. So in later Sanskrit, we have a lot of stories about Brahma, who's a little bit of a buffoon. So like either an ascetic or a demon or even a god will do a whole bunch of religious practice and all these like offerings to Brahma. And Brahma will be like, wow, you're awesome. Let me give you a wish. And he's like, I wish I could never be killed by man or God. And he goes, well, all right. And then all sorts of hell breaks loose because you have an immortal god or person or demon who wants to take over the earth, and neither man nor God can kill them. Brahma is always giving out these like sort of wishes and favors that screw everybody over. Yes, so there is a notion of a thing called the Trimurti. You'll hear a lot of Indians talk about this. Sometimes they'll talk about, Hindus will talk about like a Hindu trinity of Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu. Shiva and Vishnu show up a little bit in the Rig Veda, but not really. They're just passing names. Brahma's a big character as the creator god, but you know, even to this day, there's like maybe 2 temples to Brahma in India, and there was never a whole bunch of active temples to Brahma. Curiously, I have found smaller traditions, specifically I was reading about one in Gujarat in the west of India, that worship a sort of localized 4-armed Brahma. So they'll do this festival around Brahma Chaturbuja, and he sort of brings good luck to everyone. But what I think is really going on there is Sanskritization. Remember I said Sanskritization before is when a local tradition picks up elements and names from the elite Sanskrit in order to boost their prestige. So they probably had a local deity there that they started calling Brahma, 4-armed Brahma, and that made him a little bit more prestigious. Curiously, and I have a friend who's written on this, Brahma gets a lot of renown outside of India. So he's actually quite common to find him in Thailand, which originally was a Hindu culture before it was a Buddhist culture, and maintains quite a bit of Hindu contents. Indra, the great Indra. So Indra is the hero in the Vedas. He slays dragons, he brings the rains, he wields a rainbow weapon. He wields a dorje, which is considered, not dorje, a vajra. Sorry, I gave the Tibetan. A vajra, which is a lightning bolt. He's also a bit of a scoundrel. He's known for drinking way too much Soma. And Soma, as we're going to talk about in a minute, is a ritual drink that is intoxicating. And when he gets really drunk on Soma, all sorts of wacky stuff ensues. He's also known to be a grand sacrificer. He has a reputation for having performed 100 horse sacrifices, and we'll talk about horse sacrifices in a minute. In fact, he sometimes intervenes when someone is getting close to his record of 100 horse sacrifices and screws up their rituals so they can't beat his record. So yeah, we actually see that the gods, especially Indra, performs sacrifices to the gods. Is that to other gods? Is it to himself? Is it something beyond him? It's hard to say, but it's not just humans that sacrifice and perform rituals, but so do the gods. Now, Indra may sort of fall away in Hindu religions. You don't see a lot of temples to Indra, but in fact, there are small festivals throughout India and one large festival in Nepal that are thought to worship Indra in order to bring rains. In Nepal, you have the Indra Jatra, the sort of procession of Indra, which is like it's a multiple day festival in which there are all sorts of worships and there are all sorts of chariots that are pulled through the streets and whatnot. It's a heck of a good time. But what I see here going on is not the god Indra of the Vedas, but a god that's associated with the rains and the skies that is given the name Indra once again in Sanskritization. All right, Agni, or fire. Now, there are many myths about the fire god Agni, but most often Agni is encountered not in sort of a personified form like you'd see on the right, but you see him as the fire in sacrifices. Now, remember, in Vedic religion, there are no images, but Agni is ever present. There's a fire in almost all these Vedic rituals. So Agni is one of the only deities, other than Soma, which I'll talk about in a second, that you can actually see. Agni is present. Agni is thought by Hindus to live in all fires, even to this day, which is why if you're in a Hindu temple, you'll see that they never blow out a candle, they snuff it out. Or if you're at a Hindu birthday party, you'll notice that people won't light candles and then blow them out. They'll like pluck them out or whatnot. And generally this is because if you blow out a fire, you're spitting on God. You're putting your saliva on God. I had a colleague in graduate school who does Hellenistic religions, but she's Indian. And we got to talking about how her mother would constantly scold her and her friends when they'd have birthday parties for blowing out candles. And I remember I was at a birthday party one time, and I watched a young Indian Hindu kid attempt to blow out a candle, and his mother just get apoplectic. So yeah, don't blow out candles because you're spitting on God. And who needs to spit on God? Why would you want to spit on God? God is good. Okay, so then we have the Ashvins. I'm not going to say too much about them, but they come up again, and Doniger mentions them, and I think it's important because Doniger's somewhat obsession with horses, which is interesting, but it's a little overdetermined in my head. So these are twin gods. They have horse heads, or sometimes they're just depicted associated with horses or riding horses. They're physicians and gods of medicine, which would make you think that they would be, you know, high gods or whatnot. But in fact, because to be a physician, you have to touch all sorts of bodies and touch impure substances like blood or mucus or whatever, it's considered to make them to be sort of lower gods or ambivalent or even impure gods. They're sometimes seen as horsemen, men and horses, or sometimes they're seen just riding horses, but you'll see that they're minor, but they come up in strange places, and we will definitely see them again. All right, Soma. Soma is not only an ingredient in the ritual, which I'll talk about in a second. You may remember in the Aldous Huxley novel, Brave New World, Soma was the drug that people were constantly taking to keep them happy and pacified. And he was pulling that from this notion of Vedic religion. So Soma is a sacred and intoxicating drink. So in this sense, Soma is a god that you actually see in the Vedic ritual. So you see Agni, you see the fire, and you also see Soma, this ritual beverage that is also considered to be a divinity. Soma as an ingredient is thought to bring out intoxication, a sense of lightness, and a sense of flight. It's likely hallucinogenic. It's an entheogen. As the god, Soma is connected to the moon. Soma is also connected to Amrit, which is a nectar that brings immortality. So one of the things I wanted you to note here is that the classic gods like Shiva and Vishnu, or here's Saraswati and Ganesha, we don't find them. Shiva and Vishnu and Rudra are just kind of mentioned a little bit, like in lists of names, but they're not found there. So when people start talking about the Hindu gods being Vedic gods, these Hindu gods, for the most part, they come from a later set of texts called the Puranas. You don't really see them in the Vedas. Okay, so what are some of the Vedic rituals? Well, I'm going to go over a number of them here, and we're going to revisit this, but we're going to look at the earliest versions of them here. So there are sort of three types of ritual found in the Vedas, and these rituals are often called sacrifices, and the word for that is yagna or yajna, or my Nepali pals always say yagya. I like yagya. Yagya sounds the best to me. But I tend to prefer the Nepalese pronunciation on everything. My first Sanskrit teacher is a Nepali pundit, so I do have a little bit of Nepali twang to my Sanskrit. Yeah. Oh, by the way, go to Nepal. Nepal's fantastic. The people are great. The Nepali language is actually pretty easy to pick up, just sort of street Nepali. I've lost most of mine, but within only like a month, I was getting around doing almost all my interactions in Nepali. The culture is older. They maintained a lot of the traditions of the tantras and a lot of much older sort of Sanskritic traditions. So Nepal, if you want to go back in time and see what India might have been like, it's a good place to go for that. So anyway, so what I want to look at in these rituals is you have three types of them. You have the solemn rituals that maintain the universe and assure heaven on the part of the person doing the sacrifice. Then you also see life cycle rituals. So baby's first tooth, baby's first haircut, marriage, studenthood, funerals. Also, you see rituals for healing and magic. Now, all of these rituals are done by male actors in this sense. But in fact, in order to perform any of these rituals, the sacrificer has to have a wife. The wife is essential. And she doesn't really do all that much, at least in the texts. But from observing what goes on with contemporary Brahmins, we realize that the wives probably often knew Sanskrit, even though they weren't supposed to. And they often probably chanted along. They often probably did quite a few of these rituals to aid their husbands in these rituals. Okay, characteristics of Vedic rituals. Vedic rituals, as I keep saying, don't have any permanent structures or images. Any of the implements made, whether those are pots or ladles or altars, all of those implements would have been made of wood or clay, and they are smashed and burned, every single one of them at the end of a big sacrifice, if you have a large sacrifice. The smaller sacrifices that are done in the home have wooden ladles and wooden altars and whatnot. And when a sacrificer becomes too old to continue maintaining the ritual traditions, they burn all of those sacrificial implements. Also, when somebody becomes a monk or a renunciate, they burn those sacrificial items in a symbolic sort of death as they transform themselves into someone else, taking a new name and becoming a monk. Okay, all of these rituals are centered around fire, or Agni. Agni, like I said, is also a god. It's God and fire at the same time. And offerings are made into that fire, accompanied by intricate supporting rites and chantings. The fire is thought to carry the essence and the smells and whatnot of those offerings to the gods, which sustain the gods. The gods are thought to feed upon the smells of the fire offerings, and the sacrifice pleases the gods, and it feeds the gods. And happy gods keep the universe safe and under control, and things going well. Now, we got to remember that when you're doing one of these rituals, you just see people in a fire and whatnot, but it's thought that all the gods are there at the ritual, that the gods are guests. One interpretation of these rituals is that they're really about hospitality. It's about bringing the gods to your space and bringing people to your space, performing the rituals, giving ritual gifts and offerings to gods and humans to show hospitality in the world. I've thought that that's somewhat compelling. Okay, so let's look at some of the elements of this. First off, I talked about Soma briefly as a god before. Soma is a ritual ingredient. It's thought to come from specific stalks, and the stalks are pressed and filtered and mixed with other things, and so you get the juice out. And then it's drank, and it's an entheogen, or an intoxicant. It's likely psychedelic. People who drink it are said to feel light, as if they can fly, an expansion of their very being. Now, we don't know what Soma was. We don't have it. It's gone. So when people do these rituals these days, they have a couple of substitutes that they do, but it's not actual Soma. And the Soma that's drank in contemporary Vedic rituals is not intoxicating. Evidently, it's quite bitter and tastes kind of gnarly. I'll take a big pass on that. So in Vedic ritual, the Soma is gathered, or there is someone who comes as part of the ritual, and they have like a ritual drama where they bargain to buy the Soma, and usually like fight and argue with the guy that's selling the Soma. It's kind of fun. And then they bring the Soma around, they ritually prepare it, and it's ingested, sometimes alone at various stages in certain rituals, and other times it's ingested along with the foods that are feasted upon, the ritual offerings, or the animal sacrifices. Yeah, I said it, animal sacrifices. So sacrifice is found throughout India. In the Rig Veda, we see the sacrifice of goats and cows and horses. We have for every indication that people might not have eaten the horses that were sacrificed, but they definitely ate the goats and the cows. Throughout India today, you can find sacrifice mostly toward goddesses. And the usual creatures that are offered are no longer cows. That would be unacceptable in India today, but chickens and goats. So when I say sacrifice, I mean sacrifice. They're killing an animal. These texts are clear that actual animals are killed, and they are actually eaten, or in the case of the horse, he's cooked but not eaten. Contemporary Brahmins will sometimes use substitutions, as we're going to see in a video, but other Brahmins from other traditions say you can't have a sacrifice unless you kill something. So while the majority of Brahmins are vegetarian for most of the time, they will consume meat in the sense of doing these rituals. For some, it's kind of traumatic. For some, they kind of like it. It's like anything else. When the animals are killed, though, in contemporary rituals, like, for instance, when I've done some of the sacrifices that I've been involved with, with a chicken, you cut the head off the chicken or you slit its throat and you spray blood all over the place. Well, the Brahmins felt that blood was really impure. So what they would do is they would strangle the animal, and they would say it would be tranquilized or put to sleep. The word in Sanskrit they use is shanti. And as I say that, I hear my own little puggish dog gnawing on the door, trying to come on in. Okay, so I want to go over 3 rituals here, and then we're going to kind of wrap up this lecture. So the Ashvamedha means a horse sacrifice. This is the most grand of all the sacrifices. It's been interpreted to be symbolic, but from the art that we have, from the sources we have, people were actually doing horse sacrifices. I have a coin up here because a lot of these coins that you would find in early Indian civilizations, you would find that they would commemorate horse sacrifices being done by a king. Now, horse sacrifice being done by a king? Why is the king so important? Well, these are actually imperial ritual. The king from his kingdom would actually set a horse free, and that horse would wander wherever it chose to go for a year. It would also have the king's army behind it. And wherever the horse would show up, the person would have to be like, oh, yep, okay, you rule me. And you're like, why would I just respect if a horse wanders in town? The guy who owns the horse owns my property or has dominion over me. Well, there was an army. So you'd be like, I'm not, get away, horse. Oh, that's an army. Okay, everything's all right. So the idea would be after a year, the horse would be brought back to the king, and everywhere the horse wandered would be considered the king's kingdom. Now, remember Doniger wrote about how horses are unlike cows in the fact that they pull up the roots of the grass that they eat. So this is another nuanced thing where the horse is important, because the horse would actually kind of destroy future pastoral abilities of a pasture. And I think that resonates there. So anyway, the horse and the army return, and the king sponsors a long and complicated sacrifice. We'll go over the details of this soon. At the height of the sacrifice, the horse is strangled, then it's dismembered, and the flesh is cooked. Nobody eats the horse flesh, unlike when they kill a cow or a goat. And I'm not exactly sure what they do with the horse flesh at the end. It's probably just burned up at the very end of the ritual. Anyway, there are also some sort of wild body acts led by the queen and her retinue during this, and we'll talk about that next time. The Agnicayana, and we're going to watch a video of an Agnicayana that was done in the 1970s. In the Agnicayana, Brahmins gather, and there's one person who's the sponsor. He's called the Yajamana, or the sacrificer. He provides all of the materials, all the funds, pays for all the labor, gets everybody together. He's also thought to be the one that receives all the benefit and good luck and auspiciousness from the sacrifice. In fact, this ritual of the Agnicayana, which means the piling up of Agni, and I'll explain that in a second. The idea is that his soul is perfected. And then in fact, throughout the ritual, it goes up to heaven and then comes back to earth. And then after he dies, he and his wife will go to heaven. So what happens is they all get together, and the Brahmins make these special bricks, and they stack them up in the shape of this large brick bird. After they build the bird, then they do a round of Soma drinking, Soma pressing, and feasting. And at the end of it, the soul of the Brahmin is thought of, the Brahmin Yajamana is thought to have been perfected and ascended to heaven. Once the ritual is over, they burn the whole thing. The whole thing is just immolated. We're going to watch rituals accompanying this rite, or we're going to watch a video about this rite that was performed in the 1970s. The Agnihotra. This one's done every day. This is a smaller ritual. It's a domestic ritual. It's done in the home. A Brahmin who is initiated to do this ritual performs his ritual every morning and every night. He goes to a special clay altar in his home or near his home that he has built, and he uses a special fire. There's a fire that's always going. He's constantly maintaining. That's a sacred fire. This is one of the flames. They'll take the fire from the Agnihotra and they'll bring it to do the Ashvamedha fires and the Agnicayana fires. So it's a very special relationship to this domestic fire. Yes. So yeah, actually they'll have a ritual fire. They'll have a cooking fire. There are a number of fires that are maintained in a traditional Brahminic form. So the ritual takes about 15 minutes. It's really brief. That has about 100 different little acts, discrete operations, and it culminates in offering from this long ladle some dairy into the fire. Now, it's thought that doing this ritual ensures that the sun rises every day, and by doing this ritual, it maintains the existence of humans on Earth. Now, if on a single day a Brahmin, or not a single Brahmin, if a day arises when no Brahmins do this ritual at all, it's thought that the universe will collapse. All right, now closing up here, I want to talk about caste and social structure. So the four castes, which are the Brahmin, the priests, the Kshatriya, the barons or the warriors, the Vaishyas, the landowning agriculturalists and merchants, and the Shudras, who are the laborers. This fourfold distinction of society is found in the Rig Veda in a text called the Purushasukta, the hymn of the cosmic man. This is Rig Veda chapter 10, Mandala 10, hymn 90. So in this ritual, there is this cosmic man, and by cutting him up creates everything in the universe. It's said when this cosmic man is sacrificed, from his head come the Brahmins, from his arms come the Kshatriyas, from his legs come the Vaishyas, and from the Shudras come the feet. So in this sense, this sacred society, this notion of an eternal society, is found in the earliest of scriptures. And when Hindus talk about caste and justifying caste, they often describe this specific hymn. Now, I will put up on the website an actual translation I've done of this hymn. The hymn's filled with all sorts of nuttiness. But anytime you hear Brahmins or you hear Hindus talk about sort of the different castes as being a part of the human body, or the hierarchy of Brahmins on top, Shudras on the bottom, that's what's going on here. Now, in fact, what likely happened is the Kshatriyas were on the top, and the Brahmins composed all of their hymns to put themselves on the top in order to kind of displace the sort of real political position and power position of the Kshatriyas. All right, I had a thing I wanted to talk to you about, but I don't think we have time for today, so I'll get it into the next time. So this is the end. Now, if you look here, this is a contemporary Vedic sacrifice, I believe of an Agnicayana, and you'll see that people are holding up their phones. This stuff still happens. I think one of the coolest things about Vedic ritual, and it's so different from any other Hindu ritual, is the fact that it's so impermanent. I mean, the fact that, you know, you're temporarily initiated to do it. You create all of the instruments and all of the structures. And then at the end of everything, it's just all gone, burnt. So you've made offerings into the flames all throughout the ritual, and then the flames engulf the entire ritual space, and everyone comes out of it transfixed and amazed, just like I hope you have been. I will see you next time.